Welcome to Resilient. My name is Mike Kearney, the Risk and Financial Advisory CMO. As we continue our Confronting the COVID-19 Crisis series, we're going deeper on the challenges that the pandemic has created for our society. We're hearing from leaders who are genuinely struggling with their role at a time when employees, customers, investors, and society are demanding more of them than ever before. As these leaders formulate their strategies, the social sector will have a critical role to play. Today, we'll talk about many of these issues, including how will our communities manage through the current health, economic, and racial justice crises? What nonprofits and foundations should do to adapt? And how can they bridge a gap, especially where government policy and social safety nets are constrained? As social sector leaders anticipate and prepare for cascading impacts from the crises, they are looking for opportunities to turn disruption into opportunity. I'm joined by Shruti Sarah, a Managing Director at New Profit Venture Philanthropy, and Phil Buchanan, CEO at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Joining Shruti and Phil is Gabriel Casper, a Managing Director at Deloitte's Monitor Institute. They will share how the social sector can approach their next moves, not only confronting the COVID-19 crisis, but also thinking creatively about how to help communities thrive and innovate during these unprecedented times. So let's hear what they have to say. Shruti, Phil, and Gabriel, welcome to Resilient.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So Gabriel, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to be asking all of you a bunch of questions, so get ready. But Gabriel, I do want to start with you, and I want to talk about this Monitor Institute report that you guys recently put out called An Event or an Era. And I want you just to provide a bit of background, what question you were really looking to answer in the report and what came out of it.
Sure. So I work at a specialized unit within Deloitte called the Monitor Institute by Deloitte. We're a specialized social impact strategy consulting practice within the much larger firm. And back in March, we realized in our conversations with both philanthropic funders and nonprofits that leaders in the social sector were really struggling as COVID hit. Nonprofits that had weathered the initial storm were feeling paralyzed and trying to figure out how to adapt their programs and their operating models to new realities, whatever they might be. And funders had done a round of emergency grant making, but were really struggling to figure out what the heck to do next. And we realized that the highest and best thing we could be doing at the Monitor Institute was to use the tools we've been trained on as futurists to help nonprofits and funders get unstuck in their thinking. So with pro bono support from Deloitte Consulting, we talked with more than 80 social sector leaders over the course of about 6 weeks to understand how they were managing in the midst of COVID. And we produced this report you mentioned, An Event or an Era, which really aims to help nonprofits and foundations figure out how to navigate the hyper uncertainty of the crisis. And there's a lot of pieces to the work. But if I had to pull out just a few of the most critical takeaways, it really boils down to 5 key ideas. The first is the way that the COVID crisis is interacting with other challenges going on right now, whether it's the reckoning around racial justice happening across the country, questions around the election, the wildfires out here in California, hurricanes in the Southeast. All of these things are compounding and being compounded by the impacts of COVID. They've all become really intertwined. Second, it's really been shocking to us the degree to which nonprofits and foundations, but really all organizations, plan and operate with a single expected future in mind. So at most, they might do financial contingency planning focused on best or worst case scenarios, but we also know that no one can predict the future, and that leaves organizations really vulnerable when the future inevitably doesn't play out the way they expect. And we've found that instead, organizations really need to be prepared for a wide range of different possible futures and be ready to pivot in between them as the future sort of twists and turns. The third big takeaway is that it's becoming increasingly clear that the need for nonprofit services is going to dwarf the available capacity and resources in the nonprofit sector. So the social sector has always filled gaps that governments or markets have not. And even if there's stimulus relief, state and local governments are really going to struggle to provide the health and education, social services that their communities need. And nonprofits and donors and foundations are going to be asked to fill that gap, even though they don't have anything close to the resources to do that. The fourth big takeaway is that the impact of the crisis is going to continue to fall disproportionately on communities of color. It's really exacerbated many existing inequities, and conversations about the V-shaped or the U-shaped or even the W-shaped recovery have given way over the last month or two to talk of a K-shaped recovery, where some people and some parts of the economy really prosper and grow, and others continue to struggle or decline. And unless philanthropy makes an active effort to help the people on the bottom leg of that K, our communities are going to come out of the pandemic with really divergent outcomes and widened inequities. And then finally, the last real point that I think is critical to make from our work is that there's an absolute importance of both urgency and agency. Urgency, because if we simply wait to see how the future plays out before we act, we'll miss critical opportunities and we'll have underinvested in key contingencies we need to make. And there's simply a real urgency to act and not be paralyzed by all the uncertainty. And then agency, because even if we can't control the future, we can try to influence or nudge it our way. There are lots of ways we can use the disruption of the status quo in the current moment as a way to try and rethink and reset deeply ingrained systems. And we've been working with a lot of nonprofits and funders on how they can look for what we've been calling reset opportunities. These are the spaces where the disruption of the moment might create new possibilities for creating real social impact over time.
Gabriel, that was like a beautiful roadmap for this conversation, because we're going to be touching on a lot of those topics. But I want to pivot to Shruti and Phil, and I want to hear from you about how not-for-profits and foundations have been handling the crisis, kind of the good and the bad, just what you guys have been seeing. Maybe Shruti, I'll start with you.
Great. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be able to have this conversation. And more than that, I've been really excited to work with Deloitte and the folks like Gabriel at the Monitor Institute by Deloitte over the last several months on this scenario planning work. So I'll just start by saying it's uneven. So certain nonprofits have actually benefited in some ways from the current situation, and I don't mean that in a negative way. What I mean is that there's certain organizations that were better set up for this moment in time. Organizations that were already advancing digital delivery, for instance, in the education side, were ready for this moment in time. Organizations that have been thinking about particularly digital delivery around mental health and well-being, whether in education or in the health system, were particularly set up for this moment in time. And then there are a lot of other organizations that have been doing analog delivery of their services for years, for decades, have really struggled to think about digital delivery. And for those organizations, they've had to adapt. In many cases, they've had to adapt both their programmatic models as well as their financial models as revenue sources, typical reliable revenue sources, have come into question. So from the education side, which is the area that I lean in the most, we know that district funding has gone down for this current school year, and it's likely to go down pretty significantly for school year 21-22. So organizations are preparing to take pretty big hits in their revenue for the coming year. And I'll just name that these are hits in ways that previously organizations might have thought of as insulated revenue strategies. So organizations had come up with fee-for-service models through which they were getting reliable, repeatable revenue from districts or from the federal government to be able to support their service delivery. This is what was gold in the nonprofit sector until recently. And with COVID coming along, many organizations' fee-for-service has been the most vulnerable part of their revenue strategies. So they've had to really rethink how they approach revenue fundamentally. Does that start to answer your question, Mike?
It absolutely does. Yeah, Phil, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, I have been inspired by the response of nonprofits for the most part. I mean, just to step back, and this connects to what Trudy was just saying. If you think about what organizations are facing right now, we surveyed a representative group of nonprofits in May. 77% that of those that had a fee for service or earned revenue stream had seen that earned revenue stream decline. A majority of those organizations we surveyed had seen gifts from sort of everyday gift givers, those giving $7,500 or less. They'd seen that revenue decline. At the same time, a majority had seen increased demand. That was particularly true for direct service organizations and organizations serving historically disadvantaged communities. To Gabriel's point about who's being hit hardest, were under particular pressure. So what you have is this kind of twin reality that no small business owner would ever really be able to get their head around, of a decline in revenue with an increase in demand. And in the midst of that, organizations have not thrown up their hands or walked away. They've risen to the challenge. And I think of all kinds of change and shifts in what's being done and how, with limited revenues, in the face of the reality of just unbelievable demand.
How do you balance that, though? Because what I hear both of you saying is there's less resources, greater demand. How do you fill that gap? Is there any guidance that you would give, not-for-profits? How should they go about that? Maybe Shruti, we'll start with you, and then Phil, go to you, and then Gabriel will let you weigh in on this.
Sure. I mean, I'd start by saying question all your assumptions on how you deliver your services. So there are some services that still do need to be delivered in person. For instance, Phil talked about food delivery. There's no way of getting around that. That has to be delivered in person.
Right.
There are many other services that don't need to be delivered in person. And we've seen it with education. The entire education system has virtually went virtual on March 13th of last year, earlier this year. So it can be done, and it requires a lot of creativity. It requires really looking at what are your true drivers of impact and how do you maximize those drivers of impact while you work to shift all of the rest of the systems. And really question that. And I think that's what every single one of our organizations has done, is really question what they need to be doing in person, how it needs to be done in person, if it is actually in person, or if it could be done via video conferencing or through other means. And what they could actually creatively deliver through either synchronous or asynchronous virtual delivery models.
So it's interesting, Shruti, what I hear you saying, it's not necessarily about what their overall mission or objective is. It's about how they go about it. Is that what you're getting at? Like how they actually go about achieving their mission? Or is it actually even rethinking potentially some elements of their mission?
So I think it's a little bit of both. So one is definitely how do they go about achieving their mission as it was previously laid out. I do think that one of the things that we need to recognize, and Gabriel alluded to this with the K-shaped recovery, is that communities of color and lower income communities are actually experiencing a worse situation day to day right now. So they are still on the decline while other communities may be on the rise. And with that in mind, let's acknowledge that inequities have not just been laid bare by this pandemic, these dueling or triple pandemics that we're experiencing, but they've been exacerbated in this moment. Mm-hmm. So it may require organizations to address new or additional layers of challenges that they may not have had to address in the previous circumstance.
I want to pick up on Shruti's comment, and I think that what has been required in the short term is ruthless prioritization, dipping into reserves, which we saw even in May, 80% of nonprofits reporting that they had or would dip into reserves, capturing cost savings wherever you can, because some things aren't happening that you're therefore not having to spend on. But for this to be sustainable and for nonprofits to do what we need them to do, which, as Gabriel said, is often what business and government can't or won't, donors are going to have to step up. I mean, there is no way around it. And we are going to need a level of giving that involves some level of sacrifice by those with means and resources, whether that be institutional donors like foundations or wealthy and affluent people. That is the only way we're going to get through this without the kind of massive exacerbation of inequalities that Shruti just talked about. The only way to do it is if donors don't just give reflexively in their communities, but look at where has COVID and the economic impact had the worst results and give there and counter inequity wherever they can. So I just think, for the listeners of this podcast, whatever you've done, it's great to give, to contribute. It's not enough. And I promise you, you will not look back in 10 or 20 years and say, I wish during this moment I had done less. So we need donors to step up and support these organizations because they're not going to make it otherwise.
Hey, Phil, beyond the plea or the appeal to do more, are you seeing certain organizations engage with donors in new and innovative ways that maybe they hadn't in the past in order to help them understand the extreme need at this point in time?
Yeah, totally. I mean, one obvious answer would be, virtual galas, right? I read about a wonderful organization providing high quality preschool to homeless kids. They saw their plans for a gala sort of go up in smoke, and they said, no, we'll do it virtually. And as I remember the article, they raised as much or more money and their costs were lower. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but if you can rally your donor base to respond, that's one example. But a lot of it is also just helping people to understand what the stakes are. I mean, just literally making a case that we need you to give at a level that might not feel comfortable. And I think that's what we're called upon to do in this moment, all of us. Given the level of pain that people are experiencing.
If I could build on that, what I'd love to add is it's not just giving at a level that might feel sacrificial or increased from what your previous levels of giving are, but it's also the way that you give. So Phil alluded to thinking outside of the community that you might be naturally giving to and thinking about other communities. I'd add on a few other layers. One is think about putting less restrictions to your giving.
Totally.
A lot of organizations, to their credit, a lot of philanthropic foundations, to their credit, early on in the pandemic, reduced or eliminated the restrictions to their philanthropic giving. And that is really a testament to understanding that the field needed some flexibility. Everybody would have to change the programs and the way that they were offering those programs. The thing I'd encourage is to not now add on restrictions with new giving that you're giving at this point in time. It's going to take years to recover from this, even if we get a vaccine that's safe and effective and distributed at scale tomorrow. It's going to take years to recover from this. So my strong encouragement would be to say, reduce the restrictions and increase the flexibility of your giving. And the second point I'd make for philanthropic funders is to ask communities what they need. So ask your organizations what they want, and ask the communities that your organization serves what they want, and listen to them. So we are on the other side of the K-shaped recovery. Let's remember where we are on the K-shape. We need to understand what the communities who are struggling the most due to inequitable access to systems need right now.
Well, we've seen funders respond in a bunch of different ways, right? There's still room for giving in different ways. We've seen some funders really just try and step up the amount they're giving right now, and other funders have essentially shifted some funds from their designated strategies to really focus on basic needs. And then we've seen other funders who are really looking for where are those strategic opportunities, right? So as I said earlier, there is a moment right now to try and make strategic interventions in systems. And how can we look for those spots to give either think about how you can influence policy, how you can change long ingrained systems to really shift the things in the longer term. And I think that's an interesting piece, because funders are really going to need, and donors are really going to need, to balance between that push for giving to meet immediate needs and giving to really look towards systems change in the longer term.
Hey, Gabriel, I'm going to stick with you. One of the things that you outlined when you were talking about the elements of the paper, was this notion that crisis and risk kind of never operate within a vacuum. And while a lot of the focus has been on COVID, there's all of these other issues that are out there that's exacerbating the problem. Can you dive into that and help people understand why that's really important and how that potentially is making the challenges even worse at this moment in time?
I think the biggest thing that we've been seeing is it really does create this need to reimagine things, that in many cases it's not just about taking your existing model and putting it online. There often is a real need to fundamentally rethink how we're approaching problems. And we know that there's going to be a great increase in commercial real estate vacancies. Because businesses are realizing they don't necessarily need as much space because employees can work remotely, and many people are skittish about coming back into the office. And that's almost certainly going to create an increase in the amount of commercial real estate vacancy. Well, housing advocates have started to look at that and say, how can we take advantage of that and maybe try and change zoning regulations and create policy changes that would allow us to turn that empty commercial real estate into affordable housing, right? And so that's the sort of fundamental mindset shift that really could be powerful in these times. And people are looking for those sorts of opportunities to not just tweak their model, but to really rethink it in fundamental ways.
Phil, you want to weigh in?
Just two thoughts on mindset shifts. I mean, one is these are both hopes. I don't know if they'll be realized. One is that what is happening will heighten the appreciation of regular folks in this country for the vital work that nonprofits do, and for the fact that, contrary to many of the stereotypes you may have heard, nonprofits typically, community-based organizations, national nonprofits working on whatever issues, helping kids to learn better outside of school, mentoring programs, that these organizations are staffed by outstanding people, really talented, committed, in my view, unsung heroes. So that would be one hope. Another hope would be that donors recognize that just as you can't probably really respond effectively to COVID for all the reasons that Shruti and Gabriel have already outlined, without thinking about inequity and racial equity in particular, maybe you can't really do much of anything as a donor without thinking about that. Can you really focus on education without taking stock of the widely disparate school discipline rates for white and students of color? Can you really do something about criminal justice without focusing on racism and racial equity? Can you focus on the environment without addressing the fact that it is often Black and Latinx people who are most exposed to toxins? Maybe something good comes of this moment, that we recognize how interwoven our efforts to do good in these areas are with the need to address the role of race and racism and policies that have led to disparate outcomes in a way that maybe we haven't fully.
Yeah, and that interconnectedness, I think, is really critical. You know, when we were talking about how all these different crises that are occurring are interconnected, just as you could say COVID is the backdrop for every story, you could say that the reckoning around racial justice is the backdrop for every story. Or you could say the potential for environmental crisis is a backdrop for every other story. And recognizing the interconnectedness of those things and the need for solutions that really recognize those interconnections, I think is an important realization. And I think the fear is how bad do things need to get for us to really come to that realization and make it happen?
So one of the things that you said, and anybody can respond to this, that I find fascinating, and it was your first hope, was that the public's recognition of the value that nonprofits provide to society will increase over time, maybe as a result of this. I think that's what you said. What can they do? What can a nonprofit do to maybe help society understand the value that they truly do bring? And I'm wondering, and I'll just give you my own hypothesis, is it that there's potentially more trust in nonprofits that society has maybe than, I don't know, the government or other institutions to help through this? I guess really what I'm getting at, though, is what can they do to kind of demonstrate the value so that people are more willing to, give greater share of their wallet to really help out by demonstrating that the impact is there. Do you guys have any thoughts? Because ultimately, part of what you guys are saying is there has never been greater need than now to give to nonprofits. I hear that loud and clear. And to a certain degree, I'm always thinking of how do you create that business case? How do you create that compelling reason for people to give? Love to just get your guys' thoughts, because you do have a lot of folks that give a lot of money listening to this podcast. And so what would be your thoughts on that? They got to tell their story as best they can, right? Communicate, be open and about the challenges and also the successes. Explain what it is they're trying to do, how they think they're getting it done, and what they know about whether it's working or not, or why they're following this particular model. And invite donors in. Sometimes volunteering is the gateway. Get people in the door to see what's happening in communities, spending their time, and then ultimately that can lead down the path toward more support and contributions, and just take on head on these weird, misguided, negative stereotypes that people have about nonprofits, that they're bloated, when in fact they're often some of the most resourceful and efficient organizations around, that they have too high rates of overhead, that you should only support, and this goes to what Shruti was saying before, that you should only support the food that's being bought by the food pantry, but not the salaries of the staff who coordinate the volunteers who serve the food, or the rent for the space that the food is served in. This makes no sense, right? All of those expenses are equally important. So just taking head on some of those myths, I think would be really valuable. And then hopefully donors can respond.
Yeah, and I think the thing I'd add is that one of the complicating challenges here is that because of certain factors associated with COVID, it's actually harder for some organizations to show their impact in quantifiable ways. So if you take the entire education sector, the fact that standardized testing has either stopped completely or is being administered inconsistently across the country, it makes it hard for organizations to show that, as a result of going through our program, this is how much learning people gained through the work that they've done with us. So there are some challenges that are traditional metrics that many donors would be looking at to decide whether or not they want to give to an organization. And I think nonprofits have to get pretty creative right now to show that they are making impact without those metrics in place. So my encouragement is to get, again, I said this earlier, but I'll say it again, get the community involved. So the beneficiaries that the organizations are trying to serve, get them involved in sharing the impact that it's having, that their work is having on them. We're both a philanthropic funder and fundraiser. We work in that middle space in between funders and organizations. What we're seeing as we're looking at organizations that we're considering funding is we've involved parent leaders. We've involved people who are activists in their community, working to advance education in their community, that are from the communities that we aim to serve. We've involved them in our decision-making process so that we're getting insights from parents that are actually materially affecting our decisions for who we fund. And I'd encourage other donors to do the same. Get the community members involved in your processes of understanding an organization and whether or not they're making impact, and for the nonprofits to do that on their own as well. So bring community members to the forefront to attest to the value that your organization provides to the community.
I think there is something really powerful in what you're saying, Shruti, especially about the power of proximity and the power of place of nonprofit organizations in the midst of the crisis, right? At a time when travel and getting outside your bubble is harder than ever, it becomes really important to look for those organizations, those people that do have connection to community, that really do understand community needs in real ways. And those are the people who are going to be able to respond best to what's going on. And we're seeing that the power of proximity, the power of place becomes even more important in the midst of a crisis like this.
And I might take it one step further to say that proximity is expertise. So it's not just a trait that a person has that makes them look like the community that they aim to serve. It's actually expertise. It is a critical element of making good choices.
I just think that's so important. And I have a friend who worked in philanthropy for years, and she put it this way. She said, people are the best experts on their own lives, and that people don't much like thinking of themselves or their lives as problems to be solved by others, right? So like, I just think what Shruti is underscoring is so vital. And the only thing I would add is, for a donor, that can feel overwhelming. Like, how am I supposed to do that, on top of everything else? And so that's where I think the sort of intermediary organizations, whether it be New Profit, where Shruti is, or a community foundation, or an organization that is focused on a particular community, there are institutions that can be that proximate player for you if you can't do it yourself. So just recognize, if you're distant from a problem, provide resources to those who know how to get close to that problem, or who can bridge you and the grantees who need that funding, because not everybody can personally get out there and get connected to the communities they seek to help, but that shouldn't be an impediment to doing something.
So Gabriel, one of the things that you had talked about when you laid out some of the key observations from the report was the value of scenario planning, looking at alternative futures so that you could be ready when these different futures arise. But I think one of the things that we also heard was that many nonprofits and foundations really oftentimes have a single view of the future, and that could be problematic. Can you talk about why that is an issue, and then get maybe into the value of scenario planning?
Sure. And what we've seen is that people really do, whether it's an implicit thing or an explicit thing, they do have this official future that they tend to hold on to. For some, it was the idea things will get back to normal soon enough, and they essentially plan with it in their head that things are going to get back to normal and I can resume my operations as they were. And that's fine, except that doesn't work very well if, say, we have to remain virtual for a year or a year and a half. And then if you hadn't invested in your digital platform and you were just waiting for things to go back to normal, you would really be in a bad place. And so what we're seeing is that if you lock yourself into just one future and plan for that one future, you really leave yourself exposed and really vulnerable when it doesn't play out the way we hope for. We can be at a real loss. And so scenario planning becomes a way of stopping to think about plausible, possible futures that could emerge. And the specifics of those scenarios, in our report, we lay out 4 different possible scenarios. The specifics of those are less important than the act of living in different scenarios, because it helps to make you realize that you need to plan for other contingencies if things don't play out the way you hope, or you really do need to invest in certain things now because you won't be prepared if the future plays out in a different way. And so we've found that it becomes a critical thing to do scenario planning as a way of rehearsing for possible futures. And even if those futures don't play out exactly as you think, shaking yourself out of the expected future becomes a really critical thing. And you can begin to map out essentially what would it take and how would I be ready to pivot if the future plays out in a different way.
Hey, Shruti, I'm curious, just I'm looking at you and you're like shaking your head. So it sounds like you agree vehemently with Gabriel, but can you maybe talk about how you've seen scenario planning in your organization or another organization, or maybe where you're like, I wish we did this more robustly?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually worked with a set of our portfolio organizations, and we're continuing to work with more portfolio organizations on scenario planning. So we're taking the work that was done for this report and translating it into practice. And what I've found really interesting, just to play out what Gabriel said, is that not only does everybody, even us futurists, like I, aspiring futurists like me, who like to think of myself being able to have this flexibility. Look, I look at myself in the mirror and I've got a future in mind that I think is going to happen. I'm not going to say what it is, but I've got a future in mind. We all do. It's actually human nature. It's part of what we need to do to simplify our lives, right? And every single one of our portfolio organizations has one, but it's not just every organization. Every leader within those organizations has their own version of a future. And by not having these conversations, you don't actually realize that the leadership team may have 5 different versions of the future that are in their minds. And each one of the leadership team members is operating based on their expected future, and they're not understanding when they're hitting up against each other. They're not understanding when they're not able to meet each other in a conversation saying, well, but I thought that this is what we have to do based on what's going on. They're not even seeing that. So by making these conversations explicit, what we're seeing is that organizations can name amongst the leadership team the varying futures that they expect. And then they could actually go through the exercise and build the muscle to create the flexibility so that they can be responsive as uncertainties become more certain. A second point I'd make, and this is something that we saw when we were coaching our portfolio organizations as well, is that amid all this turmoil and this highly dynamic environment that we're in, even the organizations that are planning for various scenarios and are thinking about various scenarios get themselves stuck in thinking that they can only be responsive to the environment. And Gabriel mentioned earlier the notion of agency. In the report, we lay out a couple key uncertainties against which these scenarios are plotted. And those key uncertainties can be influenced. So one of the uncertainties, to name it, is social cooperation. So this is about people working together across lines of difference to make meaningful progress on social issues. And that is something every single organization can influence. And whether or not they realize it, they are influencing it. So if you don't recognize that you're part of the game, you're not just a recipient of what happens in the game, but you're actually influencing the game, then you lose your ability to influence it wisely. And you don't recognize you can inadvertently make moves that could push you in one direction or the other, push the field in one direction or the other. And you don't want to do that inadvertently. You want to be intentional about that. And then I'd say the final thing that we saw from working with our organizations is that there's just such a desire for equilibrium. Again, this is basic and fundamental human nature. The systems, and not just human nature, systems seek equilibrium, right? And there's a potential for a missed opportunity. Gabriel mentioned wanting to get back to normal. All of us want to get back to normal. And what we've learned, if we've learned anything through this, is that normal wasn't working. Normal especially wasn't working for some populations who have been systematically underserved and who the systems have worked against for so many decades. And so normal isn't good. We don't want to get back to normal, and we have to resist that urge. And I think if we don't go through this process of scenario thinking, we have the danger of allowing ourselves to get back to normal and not demand a new future, not demand a re-architecture of the systems that have been so fundamentally flawed in getting us to where we are.
To Shruti's point, the tendency is to want to think about when will we get back to foundation payout levels that were what they always were, or individual giving levels, or ways of operating our teams where we didn't spend so much time worrying about folks' mental health. Well, maybe we're not getting back to some of those things. And maybe we shouldn't be in a rush to, because maybe what we need is to question to the point that both Shruti and Gabriel made, what it was we were doing before, and not just try to get back to that, even though I totally agree there is this natural human tendency to want to, and like Shruti says, that's what we got to fight against.
I was just going to say, one of the things that we've begun to do working with New Profit and Shruti is to work with both funders and nonprofits to really do this sort of scenario planning work too, so that they can look and say, regardless of what future comes about, what are the robust moves we can make that would work in any scenario? And we work a lot on thinking about what are the hedges or the bets that you want to make given various certain scenarios that might emerge. And so we've begun to work with individual funders, groups of funders, individual nonprofits, groups of nonprofits, to really do that sort of work either on their own or together, to really start thinking about what is the path forward for my organization? How do I find these opportunities to push the future in the way I want it to, and to find ways to really reset systems and change the way things are going to play out. And so that's been a big part of our work since we wrote the report, has been really how do we help people stop and think and take action at a moment when action is really important. And there's a real opportunity for both nonprofits and philanthropic foundations to step up and be a critical part of whatever recovery and shaping whatever the new normal might look like.
Yeah, I was just going to build a little bit. We've been talking a lot about what nonprofits and foundations can do for obvious reasons. One of the things that I just named for this audience of people who may also have political and social capital to wield is to think about policies and policy changes that could be supportive of what we're trying to do in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. There's so much opportunity for policy change. But the other thing that's interesting from that is that the results are uneven across geographies. So there are certain locations where, due to policy choices, all students are doing better than they were pre-COVID. And there are certain other locations where, again, due to policy choices and other infrastructure choices, all students are doing worse. And that, to me, is a factor that I think we really need to take into account. And I would encourage this audience to exercise your political and social capital to drive policy change in the right direction.
I'm so glad you went there, Shruti, because that's exactly the question I was going to ask around, we've got a lot of leaders that listen to the podcast. What can leaders do in this area? Maybe Phil and Gabriel, if you could just kind of pick up where Shruti left, because I'd love to hear, if you're a leader, if you're a CEO of an organization and you do have clout, both political, societal, and just within your organization, what would you tell them to be focused on right now? Maybe Phil, if you want to go.
Sure. I think Shruti said it well. To identify those areas where you can influence policy, absolutely. To raise awareness of those who listen to you about the inequities that you see, and model what it looks like to do something about it, to sacrifice some of your own comfort, to really try to be a part of creating a country in which your zip code or your race are not predictive of outcomes? What does that look like, as opposed to just defaulting to, corporate giving that is sort of reflexive to the place you happen to have employees without thinking about the broader implications? Those are some of the thoughts that I have. We have to decide as a society that we don't want to be this way, right? That we want to be a place where the rhetoric about equality of opportunity matches the reality. We haven't done that. People in leadership roles can make that case to those who are listening to them, and I hope that they do.
And operate, their businesses in ways that
absolutely
that reflect that, and
pay a living wage, for example.
I'm curious, Phil, are you getting at, how do I frame this up? A lot of organizations have programs to give to nonprofits or charities that they care about. I think what you're getting at, and I may be totally wrong, is that don't just go through the motions, like almost live kind of the values of the organization and talk about what matters in our environment, in our society, in our country, and align that with where they're directing their energy of it as an organization to the programs that they care about. Meaning, like, just don't go through the motions. I don't know if that's what you're getting at or not, but that's kind of my takeaway.
Well, and to what I think Gabriel was trying to get at, like, be prepared to do within your own organization things that ensure that there's, for example, equity in pay, by race and gender, that people are paid a living wage. There's a lot of happy talk about what corporations can do, and this kind of illusion that profit and social impact are just beautifully linked in some linear way, when the reality is that's not the case. That sometimes corporate leaders have to decide to sacrifice profit for something bigger, to make sure that the fabric of the society in which they operate holds and is strengthened. And so I think, on the corporate philanthropy front, I hope people resist the urge to just get the PR placement and recognize that actually, if you're going to make a difference, you got to be doing it in alignment with a lot of other actors, and that they resist the happy talk of sort of profit and impact always being beautifully aligned, because, well, sometimes they are, maybe in the area of solar energy, for example, sometimes they're just not. And so leadership is about making those tough choices and deciding that our values compel us to do something that might be hard.
Well, and we're seeing more and more businesses recognize that purpose matters, right? And that it's not enough to just try and go directly towards maximizing profit, and thinking about all of, a responsibility to communities, a responsibility to the world we live in. All of those things are important. And the business practices, not just the corporate philanthropy as a way of giving back, but really aligning business practices to fit the values that we all hold and espouse, is really, really important. And it's starting to become more and more a topic of conversation in the corporate world, and not just be the domain and the work of the social sector and the government.
So I've got two final questions, and I basically call this the lightning round. And since we have three people on, I'm just going to ask each of you to respond, maybe 30 seconds or less, and we'll hold you to that. And the first one is, we came up with this podcast about 4 years ago, and it was really in search of resilient leaders, resilient organizations. And so I'd love just to hear your perspective, is what, in your opinion, makes for a resilient nonprofit organization? Shruti, I'll start with you.
Exercising leadership and dealing with situations that it hasn't yet come against, and not just looking at technical shifts that the organization can make, I think organizations have to be adaptive if they want to be resilient. If nothing else, COVID is showing us that we all have to exercise our adaptive leadership muscles even more strongly. In fact, I think that's what scenario planning is all about.
I'm going to switch it up. I'm going with Gabriel this time. Gabriel, what's your thoughts?
I think I could say it pretty simply. The most resilient organizations are those that have the widest array of choices and alternatives when the future goes a different way than they might expect, and is ready to pivot when the future plays out differently. Right. And so it's the same thing Shruti was talking about. It is the ability to adapt and the ability to adjust and the preparedness to pivot.
Phil?
I think I would say yes, adaptive in practice, but real clarity and consistency in purpose and values and mission, and an understanding of what we stand for and who we're also not.
Yeah. Great point.
Agree with
My
that.
final question. Awesome. I'm going to start with you, Phil. I'm just kind of going backwards this time. The question that I oftentimes would ask, as I just did, was about what makes a resilient leader. And we found recently, which is interesting to me, that the number one answer when I say what makes a resilient leader has been a leader that's optimistic or has hope for the future, which I love. And I've said this just on a recording that I did the other day. That's how can you be resilient if you don't have hope for the future? So the question I want to close it with, and Phil, I'm going to start with you, is given all of these challenges that you all have shared today, what is the one thing that gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope is that I think we are seeing in this country a outpouring of decency and a focus on what connects us. I think that's what we saw in the protests this summer. I think that's what we're seeing in the response of community-based organizations to those in need. And I think ultimately that decency will prevail and will make our country stronger in the years to come than it has been in recent years.
Gabriel, what gives you hope?
Hope isn't just saying optimism and saying things will be better. It really is about recognizing that we can try and influence the future we live in and make this a better place. And one of the things that Phil and Shruti and we at the Monitor Institute have been working on for a long time is how can we help the social sector become more powerful and more able to really drive that future forward.
Shruti, I'm going to let you close this out. What gives you hope for the future?
So very similar to my colleagues who've just spoken, I'll just set the stage a little bit. So prior to March, we, the people around this virtual table and many people around the country knew that there are systems and structures that drive fundamental inequities in our social sector, in education and healthcare, whatnot. We've been all working to change this in our own ways, and it was hard to imagine making wholesale fundamental changes to these systems. And then the pandemic hit. And on March 13th, we closed schools across the country, as an example. It was something that was completely unthinkable to imagine closing schools. And in fact, it would have felt amoral to do so. But we did it. We did it for the right reasons. And the pandemic, along with the other crises that followed, enabled us to see on full display the systemic inequities that exist. They've laid them bare and they've exacerbated them. And my hope, I wouldn't be a social entrepreneur if I didn't think this way, is that this creates an opportunity. This ability to see all of this creates an opportunity, and the fact that we've shut a lot of systems down in the ways that we knew them, create an opportunity for greater wholesale redesign and re-architecture of our systems so that they can be rooted in equity. And that's what I'm fighting for.
That's awesome. You know what? Usually I don't answer my own questions, but I will say what gives me hope is to have leaders driving change and supporting nonprofits, foundations, and making a difference in this world. So it's people like you that give me hope. So I appreciate all of your time, Shruti, Phil, and Gabriel, thank you for being guests on the Resilient podcast. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Shruti, Phil, and Gabriel, thank you very much for your time. That was incredible. I am truly inspired by your work and innovative approaches to help create a better world. I'm hopeful that your work and inspiration can help us come together to create new ways to address some of society's most pressing issues. We have covered a lot of topics over the last 8 months in this series. I cannot believe it's been 8 months. And as we continue, we'd like to hear from you about what topics and what guests you want to hear from. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter and share your ideas. Say feedback is tremendously helpful as we continue to prioritize and identify what we're going to bring to you next. For more insights across all aspects of COVID-19, just go to Deloitte.com or on our COVID-19 page. You can also listen to Resilient on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.